Jesus Christ, the temperature is erratic. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And I think you know what time it is. Kraftwerk and Kraftwerk 2. So for those of you who missed it, the other day I put up a vote for people to pick my next discography review between Kraftwerk and Jean-Michel Jarre, and while I personally put them on approximately equal footing, with both being major pioneers in the electronic music world, with my personally being more impressed by Jarre's continuing to reinvent himself and stay relevant all the way into 2017, though Kraftwerk having more nostalgia, as they were one of the very first electronic bands I ever got into. Like, we're talking just Orbital and Air before this. And from what I can tell, are way more influential a band. Like, we're talking one band that I think most people consider to be the true godfathers of electronic music. I know I said Depeche Mode could be the godfathers of synth pop in my review of their new album, but that was an ad-lib I meant to edit out because they're nothing compared to Kraftwerk. And yeah, while I think I respect Jarre and Kraftwerk about equally, the actual vote that I put up did not come even close. Kraftwerk won 70% of the votes and had easily quadruple the enthusiasm in the comment section, and obviously I'm doing their discography now. Now, of course, perhaps unfortunately, we do have to start all the way back in 1970 before electronic music was even really a thing. And yes, that does mean before Kraftwerk were really into it as well. This first album sounds nothing like they did afterwards, and fans of the band who haven't already heard this one are going to be in for some serious sonic whiplash. See, back in the early 70s, there was this big scene commonly referred to as krautrock that, I can't even begin to describe. There were like a whole bunch of German rock bands who were doing all sorts of weird experimentation akin to that of Pink Floyd, and there's quite a big variety that stretches from somewhat more straightforward psychedelic rock, space rock, prog rocky kind of stuff like Can, Neu, and Faust, to some early electronic ambient stuff like Popol Vuh, or however you say it, Cluster, Ashra Temple, Klaus Schultz, and of course Tangerine Dream, as well as others who I'm sure I'm forgetting. I'm not going to call myself an expert on this scene, still kind of dipping my toes in it, and only the latter three have I heard more than one album from. Even still have to explore Ashra outside of their self-titled debut and New Age of Earth. Yeah, I know, and you have no credibility to talk about the subject, but yeah, I'll get on it. But I can already tell, from what I have heard from these bands, there's a lot of cool stuff to be found in the krautrock scene, provided you can stomach the rampant weirdness and the not giving a fuck about tonality and traditional rhythmic structures and all that. Basically, if you heard Pink Floyd's A Saucer Full of Secrets track, or anything on Ummagumma, if you can stomach that, you can stomach krautrock. They often go in these outer reaches of music. But if you go into this self-titled debut from Kraftwerk expecting the kind of accessible synth-heavy stuff they became famous for, you ain't gonna get it here. And, I don't know what to tell you guys. Even with the rest of the krautrock scene in mind, and being a big Pink Floyd fan myself, I've never really cared for Kraftwerk's debut all that much. Without the background, it was weird and uncharacteristic. With the background, it's kinda lackluster. Like, how about this? See, before Kraftwerk was actually Kraftwerk, they were called Organization. They still had Ralph Hutter and Florian Schneider and some other people, and they released an album called Tone Float. That album is also ridiculously out there and psychedelic and experimental, but I think it's a bit more fun of a listen. The title track in particular was quite fun. Granted, I'm a little less impressed by the second side, but still fine stuff. Like that kind of Ummagumma weird percussion experimentation and other weirdness. But while Tone Float had like 2 tracks that stood out to me, and one of which took up an entire side of the album, and the other was the last track on there, There's really only one track I particularly cared for on Kraftwerk's debut, and that was the first one, Rook Zook. So that's like half a side that I would willingly come back to. Now this track has some cool ascending and descending flute progressions, some catchy rhythms, and of course some weird sidetracks and tempo changes here and there. And even so, it's just a good song and not a great one. Probably not going to make my top 10 or anything. And after the repeat listens I needed to give it to for this review, I got kinda sick of it too. The rest of this album is even more out there than Tone Float was. There's a lot of rock elements and really harsh, distorted noises all over this album. While it was unnerving but interesting at first, it just kind of became dull after a while. The novelty of, like, psychedelic krautrock, but they're also trying to figure out how to make music with machines at the same time, but they haven't actually figured it out yet. Alright, the other tracks. Stradivarius has some unsettling guitar feedback ambience in the beginning, but goes on various side tracks, like one part where it sounds like a door shutting and someone walking away in the style of Yes's South Side of the Sky, which hadn't actually come out yet by this point, but whatever. There's a lot of psychedelic messing about, and a section where these string sounds and guitars just kind of float aimlessly out in the open. And it eventually ends up on this intense, over-the-top rock jamming. Like, again, interesting, but between the harsher and more distorted tones they use and the general lack of actual melody, just not the kind of thing I can see myself returning to much. Megaherz, I see what you did there, is mostly ambient and I guess has some pretty cool flute sounds in it. Some sections are actually kind of tranquil and relaxing, but others are not. By the way, while I do very much enjoy Florian Schneider's use of the flute in this album and some of their other earlier albums, I think he did use it to better effect later down the line. And the final track, Von Himmel hoch, like Stradivarius, is an interesting track that does not lend itself well to repeat listens. It's actually kind of a creative idea. Like, it starts out with them imitating the sounds of planes flying over and dropping bombs with their vintage synths, hence the title, which approximately translates to coming down from heaven. That being said, 10 minutes of mostly just that is not that interesting. And while it does have the common courtesy to go back into some slightly more interesting rock jamming in other parts that I will admit gets my foot tapping, and even features Klaus Dinger, who would go on to be part of Neu on the drums. But yeah, do I see myself ever coming back to Kraftwerk 1 ever again? Probably not. I think a big part of why this album does so little for me is probably just expectations. When you listen to this album, it's not the kind of thing that I think will, like, really exemplifies why the name Kraftwerk is held in such ridiculously high regard. While it's interesting, I suppose, I'd much rather listen to Pink Floyd. They offer this kind of experimental rock kind of thing, but just make it more fun to listen to on average. I'm not sure if the whole adding in the machines can make music too, by the way, thing just is still kind of a novelty at this point. I don't think it really worked to their strengths yet. They hadn't figured it out. I know I sound like I just heard this album, but like I actually first heard this album a couple of years ago, but whatever. I guess this album is cool if you want to see sort of where the band name comes from. Like, Kraftwerk roughly translates to power station, and this does undoubtedly have a sort of industrial feel to it. But the band themselves seem kind of wary about associating with their first 3 albums, and with the exception of Ralph and Florian, which I will get to in a video by itself, I can definitely see why. They sound like a completely different band on Kraftwerk 1, and it's just not that fun to listen in the first place. And since it'll make probably too short a video by itself, I'll also talk about their second album as well. Kraftwerk 2 is not a lot better than Kraftwerk 1, but it is better. And this raise in quality is carried almost entirely by the first track, Klingklang. This track is a 4-part suite that actually sounds more like the typical Kraftwerk sound, very bright and cheerful and melodic, and while undoubtedly more experimental than what one might usually be used to from them, especially when you consider the fact that there were no synthesizers involved in the album at all, mostly live instrumentation and tape manipulation and that kind of thing. I like how the intro is just kind of bell sounds that sort of call back to the Tone Float album, and each of the 3 sections is a quite enjoyable listen that actually sounds like Kraftwerk and shows why people like them in the first place. This track single-handedly redeems the entire album, honestly, but as for the rest, I hate to say it, but you know how I said Kraftwerk 1 got dull with a lot of repeat listens over the past couple of days? The vast majority of Kraftwerk 2 was almost painfully dull right from the get-go, right when I first heard it, like, a couple of years ago. I forget when exactly. The track Strom, aka Current, is okay. Starts out with some atonal guitar experimentation, but later evolves into an actually pretty haunting track with some cool layered flute melodies. But the rest... nah. Atem, aka Breath, is what it says on the tin. 3-minute recording of breathing. Seriously. Harmonica is no blues number, but rather just slowly playing notes on one. Even more slowed down with tape manipulation, too. And that leaves Spule 4, aka Reel 4, as well as Wellenlänge, aka Wavelength, which are just kind of aimless experimental guitar pieces. I guess I have been in the mood to listen to the latter before, like, it has a cool atmosphere, I guess. But if I'm not in the mood, these 2 tracks just seem to go on forever, and it's like the musical equivalent of paint drying. It's almost hard to compliment the album that much with tracks as boring as these taking up such a huge chunk of the album. These guys were just purely experimenting with sound and equipment, and weren't yet making the kind of accessible and easily enjoyable music we know them for today. Only on Klingklang did they really make the breakthrough that would lead them to their now recognizable sound. See, here's the thing though, like, I'd give the first 2 Kraftwerk albums more of a pass, like, if for some reason they were like some of the first electronic music in history. Which is kind of true, but, like, there was, like, Edgard Varese and Stockhausen way before these guys showed up, so... I mean, they didn't invent electronic music. They are not the first people ever to think of the idea, oh, let's try making music using machines. Now, of course, the question is, do I recommend these 2 albums? Well, I'll put it this way. These albums are, as I've said many times over the course of this review, experimental. It's just these 2 German guys screwing around with equipment and making weird noises with it. They're studies, basically. But I say these 2 albums are worth checking out if you want to see Kraftwerk's sound still in prototype mode and not fully realized yet. It's worth it if you want to see examples of that really early electronic music, and it's not like there's no straightforward enjoyment to be found here at all. As I said, Rook Zook is a pretty fun track, and there are a lot of other cool ideas on the first album. And the second has Klingklang, which I'm not gonna act like is an underlooked classic track in their discography that automatically makes Kraftwerk 2 a must-listen, but it is very enjoyable in a much more straightforward kind of way that you could only get from Kraftwerk. So I say, while my repeat listens of them have absolutely worn them into the ground, and I don't see myself coming back to them much at all again after recording this video, and while I believe this would be a terrible place to start if you're looking into Kraftwerk for the first time, both albums are worth a shot for curiosity and for completionists. These are Kraftwerk as sonic scientists having yet to become the world-changing artists that they are, and these albums are not bad for that, but I'd also be lying if I said I pulled these out with much frequency or see myself pulling them out more in the future. For Kraftwerk 1, I'm feeling a 6.3 out of 10, and for Kraftwerk 2, 6.7. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.